We left off in the second step of the HACCP process, where you're attempting to, again, looking at your operation. You're looking at points in the process where you can identify where you might present or prevent a hazard, or at least reduce it to safe levels. These are the points that are known as those critical control points. And all of the things on the little diagram here can be a critical control point. They've highlighted cooking in this particular example because they, in the next slide, they recommend an example of chicken, a prepared chicken product that, let's say, you put on the grill and serve to a customer. And because you're going to cook it and serve it right away, cooking is identified as the critical control point that you must cook it to 165 degrees, which then becomes the critical limit. So the cooking is the point. The limit is what we have come to accept as the correct temperature for cooking poultry that can destroy any bacteria that might be surviving in it. If you were cooking a different food, then that critical limit would be different. And in some instances, the critical limit is a time, not just a temperature. So those limits are individualized for each recipe, and I'll have an example for you at the end so you can see an example of that. Then, once you've analyzed your hazards, you have determined your critical control points, you've set some critical limits, then you determine, well, how are we going to keep track of this? How are we going to monitor it? And it usually involves a combination of temperature taking and logging, and then a system for monitoring that. And usually there is an individual that's determined to be responsible. Typically that individual would not be named by name, but identified by position, so that when the full-time person has their days off, you have someone who backs them up, and that particular position is always responsible for checking temperatures at a certain point in the recipe. The fifth step is to determine, well, what are the corrective actions when you check a particular recipe or you take a temperature and you realize that the chicken breast is not at 165 degrees. Well, then you can put it back in the oven or back in the broiler, as this image shows, and let it cook longer until it reaches the 165 degree internal temperature. That's an example. Some of the things that we saw in the video talked about a product that didn't reach a temperature within a certain amount of time, and they said you might have to cool it all the way down and then reheat it again. But again, you're going to determine that based on what you know to be the best practice on the recipes that you prepare in your particular institution. So you need to have a corrective action. It needs to be built into the recipe or the procedure that you're working with. Then you need to build again into your system, design into your system, a method to verify that it's actually working. So you look at those logs. Usually this would be then a supervisor, a lead, might be a dietitian, might be a restaurant manager, but you look back over the plan to see, is it actually being checked? Are there records for temperatures? Are there documents that you've kept that show that things are actually being checked? And then you look to see, well, did something get discarded because it didn't reach temperature? Or is it perhaps taking too long to reach the appropriate temperature consistently? Maybe you need to modify your recipe by either raising the temperature of the oven or the grill so that the food reaches the correct temperature within the appropriate amount of time. Or maybe you need to modify the time limit if you can still do that, looking at the bigger picture and determining what the appropriate time in the danger zone would be. But anyway, this verifying step basically helps you to determine if your plan is actually reducing or eliminating those hazards that you've. Then the seventh step is, again, more record keeping. It's a way of recording what you monitor, what you have corrected, that you have maybe got some double checks for your equipment to be sure that you're actually that it's working and that the temperature that it says on the thermostat is actually the temperature that it achieves. And then you could also have some records from suppliers that you would document. You may be taking temperatures of the delivery trucks when they arrive, and then maybe even doing a double check by going as far as back to the distribution center and checking their refrigerators and getting copies of their records periodically. So whatever system you have, whether it's electronic, whether it's in a notebook or a logbook, some kind of a system for monitoring that is a critical part of this plan. This is a great example of a recipe for beef stew that has been written with HACCP principles in mind. So you'll notice that in the they've identified in this column. Let's see if I can write on here. In this column here, what the potential hazards are. They point out that right here, when you take the beef cubes out of the refrigerator, that they should be at 40 degrees, and that you then brown them and bring them to a temperature of 190 degrees within 15 minutes. There are some other things. Bring water to a boil, or bring the liquids to a boil at 212, and then simmer at 190 for an hour. At some point, it's going to say, I think, to take the, here we go down here. It talks about when you finish the product, you maintain a food temperature of 165 degrees. So there's another limit that has been set. Anywhere where you see a limit or a time, a temperature or a time, those are limits. So this is a great example of a recipe that has been written with HACCP control in mind. There are a few restaurant opportunities or occasions when they may need a particular variance or an exception to a HACCP plan. Smoking food as a method for preservation, not just to enhance flavor, using certain kinds of additives, curing food, and custom processing of livestock are all things that most of us won't ever encounter in an institutional environment. But if this is done in a restaurant, then there would again need to be very specific policies and procedures, probably with some guidance from the Food Safety Inspection Service that describes how these processes are done, how they're monitored, and they might need a specific type of a HACCP plan that would be unique to these particular products. At least, you might also see a specific HACCP plan required anytime an organization is doing modified atmospheric packaging, vacuum packaging, or sous vide, or if they're pasteurizing juice to sell later, or sprouting seeds or beans, because those are all high-risk activities. So I think that will conclude the idea of HACCP. Again, typically an organization, if you are not a part of a larger organization, generally you will start with one recipe that contains TCS food, and once you have a system developed for one recipe, it's fairly easy to extend it to the other recipes in your system. This is commonly the thing that students or dietetic interns are asked to help with, because many times it takes many steps and lots of tests to make sure that the end product is what you desire. But that's the conclusion of HACCP. Thanks.